The mother-in-law only came because she heard the food was free, my son-in-law said into the microphone, and the room burst into laughter before I even had time to set my napkin down. For a moment the sound rolled across the restaurant like a wave, glasses clinking, chairs shifting, people leaning toward each other with amused smiles. I sat very still at the round table near the back of the room, my hands folded gently in my lap, the white linen tablecloth smooth beneath my fingertips. The restaurant was one of those polished places downtown with tall windows and soft amber lights hanging from the ceiling, the kind of place where a dinner for two could easily cost more than $200. Tonight the room had been reserved to celebrate Daniel's promotion at his firm, a milestone everyone said he had worked very hard to earn. A banner near the bar read "Congratulations Daniel" in large gold letters, and servers in black jackets moved quietly between tables carrying trays of sparkling water and small plates of appetizers. My daughter Emily sat 2 chairs away from me, her shoulders slightly tense, her eyes fixed on the table as if studying the silverware arrangement. When the laughter faded, Daniel raised the microphone again with a grin that seemed perfectly comfortable in the glow of attention. He stood near the head table in a tailored navy suit, one hand tucked into his pocket, enjoying the reaction he had just created. "You all know Margaret," he continued, gesturing loosely in my direction without actually looking at me. A few heads turned. I could feel their eyes, curious but polite, waiting to see how the mother-in-law would react. I offered a small smile, the same calm expression I had worn through decades of family dinners, school recitals, hospital waiting rooms, and quiet Sunday mornings when Emily was still a little girl eating pancakes across from me. Daniel chuckled softly and added something about how promotions attract distant relatives and free meals attract even more of them, which earned another ripple of laughter around the room. I lifted my water glass and took a slow sip, the cold edge of the glass steady against my lips. From where I sat I could see nearly every table, Daniel's colleagues in pressed shirts and elegant dresses, neighbors from their subdivision, a few distant cousins I barely recognized anymore. They all seemed relaxed, leaning into the easy humor of the evening, enjoying a celebration that was supposed to be simple and proud. The strange thing was that no one in that room actually knew the whole story behind Daniel's success, and I suppose that was part of why his joke sounded harmless to them. They didn't know about the long months years ago when Emily called me late at night worried about rent, or the envelope I quietly mailed that helped cover Daniel's graduate school tuition when scholarships fell short. They didn't know about the winter when Daniel lost his first job and I spent 3 weekends watching their toddler so he could drive 3 hours each way to interviews. Those were small details, invisible threads woven into the life of a family, the kind of things that rarely make it into speeches or toasts. I set my glass down carefully and looked toward the stage again as Daniel continued thanking his manager, his team, and the amazing support system that helped him reach this point. The microphone amplified every word with perfect clarity. The room nodded along, appreciative and warm. From the outside it probably looked like a lovely evening, a successful young professional celebrating a new chapter, friends raising glasses, soft music playing from hidden speakers. I sat quietly and listened, the faint scent of roasted chicken and fresh bread drifting from the kitchen, and I wondered if Daniel even realized how easily people believe the version of a story that gets told first. The laughter around the room faded into the comfortable noise of conversation, forks touching plates and quiet music drifting through the speakers near the ceiling. Daniel continued speaking into the microphone, thanking his team, mentioning late nights at the office, and describing the promotion as the result of years of dedication. People nodded approvingly. Some even raised their glasses toward him. I remained seated at my table, my hands resting gently on the edge of the tablecloth, listening to the steady rhythm of his voice as if it were part of the background music. It was curious how easily a room could accept a version of events when it sounded confident enough. I watched Daniel carefully. He was relaxed, smiling easily, the kind of smile that suggested he believed every word he was saying. From where I sat, I could also see Emily. My daughter had turned slightly in her chair, her fingers slowly circling the stem of her glass. She did not laugh this time. She did not look toward me either. Instead, she kept her eyes lowered as if studying the faint pattern in the linen. That small detail told me more than anything Daniel had said. Emily had always been easy to read, even as a child. When she was proud, she glowed. When something troubled her, she grew very quiet. Tonight she was quiet. Daniel went on to describe the early days of his career, telling the room how determined he had been to build everything from the ground up. The phrase sounded impressive, and several people near the front table murmured in agreement. I slowly folded my napkin once, then again, placing it neatly beside my plate. The action was small, almost invisible, but it gave me a moment to think. Because the truth was that the story Daniel was telling was not entirely wrong. He had worked hard. I had seen him stay up late preparing presentations. I had watched him drive through heavy rain to attend meetings hours away. Effort had never been his problem. The problem was memory. Memory had a way of fading when success arrived, and sometimes the past became inconvenient once the present looked polished and complete. The room applauded when Daniel thanked Emily for standing by him through the difficult years. He reached down from the small stage and squeezed her shoulder affectionately. She smiled for the room, but the smile did not quite reach her eyes. I noticed that detail too. A waiter passed by my table and quietly asked if I needed anything. I shook my head and thanked him, watching as he carried a tray of glasses toward another group of guests. Around me the celebration continued smoothly. People were relaxed now, comfortable in the warm glow of a professional success story. A promotion was a simple narrative. Hard work, determination, achievement. It fit neatly into a speech and even more neatly into the applause that followed. Daniel lifted his glass toward the audience and said that tonight was about gratitude and new beginnings. Another round of applause filled the room. I joined in politely, tapping my fingers together with the rest of the guests. My expression remained calm, the same small smile resting on my face. But inside my mind I could not help replaying a quiet memory from several years earlier, a rainy afternoon when Daniel and Emily sat across from me at my kitchen table with worried expressions and a stack of bills between them. Back then there had been no microphone, no applause, and certainly no crowd of well-dressed colleagues celebrating his future. There had only been the three of us, a pot of coffee growing cold on the counter, and a conversation about how they were going to keep their home. Daniel finished his speech by thanking everyone for coming to celebrate with them, and the room responded warmly once again. He looked proud, confident, completely at ease under the lights. I watched him carefully, realizing that the evening was only beginning and that stories told in public sometimes have a way of continuing longer than the person holding the microphone expects. I continued watching the room as the applause slowly settled into a comfortable hum of conversation. Daniel stepped away from the microphone, shaking hands with a few of his colleagues near the stage, his confidence growing with every compliment he received. Someone near the front raised a glass and called out congratulations again, and a small wave of cheerful voices followed. It was a pleasant scene from the outside. Warm lighting. Elegant tables. People enjoying an evening meant to celebrate progress and success. I sat quietly and allowed the moment to unfold without interrupting it. My water glass was still half full. A thin slice of lemon floated near the rim, turning slowly each time someone brushed the table. I lifted the glass again and took another calm sip while the memory from earlier years continued to move gently through my mind. There had been a time when Daniel and Emily did not attend celebrations in places like this. Back then their world was much smaller. I remembered the tiny apartment they rented after finishing college, a narrow building near the edge of town where the stairway always smelled faintly of fresh paint and old carpet. Their living room had barely enough space for a sofa and a small coffee table, but Emily had tried to make it feel warm with soft lamps and framed photographs. Daniel used to sit at the kitchen counter late at night with his laptop open, studying business case reports and making notes for classes that he hoped would lead to a better position someday. He had ambition even then. I respected that about him. Ambition, when guided well, could build a good life. But ambition also had a quiet companion called pride, and pride sometimes rewrote memories in subtle ways. Around me the guests continued talking about Daniel's promotion, praising the company that had recognized his potential. A group of his co-workers stood near the bar discussing new projects and future opportunities. I heard someone mention that Daniel had built his career entirely through determination and discipline, and several people nodded as if they had witnessed the whole journey themselves. I did not interrupt them. They were simply repeating the version of the story that had just been offered from the stage. Emily eventually stood from her chair and walked toward Daniel, placing a gentle hand on his arm as he spoke with a group of guests. He turned to her with an easy smile, the kind of smile that cameras always capture at events like this. For a moment they looked exactly like the successful young couple everyone believed them to be. I watched them from across the room and felt a mixture of pride and quiet reflection. Emily had worked hard too. She had balanced jobs, family responsibilities, and long evenings helping Daniel prepare for presentations and interviews. Those details were rarely mentioned in speeches, but they had been part of the same long road that led to tonight's celebration. The waiter returned and placed a warm plate in front of me. Roasted chicken, green beans, and a small portion of mashed potatoes arranged neatly beside it. The food looked excellent, though I was not very hungry. I picked up my fork and slowly tasted a bite while the music shifted into a softer instrumental tune. At the far end of the room someone laughed again about Daniel's earlier joke, repeating the line about the mother-in-law and free food. The words floated lightly through the air, carried by friendly amusement. I allowed myself a small, patient smile. People often laughed at the simplest version of a story. It was easier that way. Simpler. Cleaner. But stories had a way of growing larger when time allowed them to unfold, and tonight there was still plenty of evening left. The music in the restaurant softened as dinner continued, and conversations drifted comfortably between tables. I set my fork down for a moment and looked across the room again. Daniel was still surrounded by a small group of colleagues, each one eager to shake his hand and congratulate him. Every few seconds another laugh rose from their circle. It was the kind of laughter that follows success, the kind that assumes the story being celebrated is complete and uncomplicated. I watched quietly, remembering that life rarely unfolds in such simple lines. My thoughts returned again to that rainy afternoon years earlier when Daniel and Emily had come to my house. I could still picture the gray clouds hanging low outside the kitchen window, the sound of rain tapping steadily against the glass. Emily had sat at the table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. Daniel had been flipping slowly through a stack of papers, each one a bill or a notice that seemed to carry more weight than the last. They had both tried to sound calm at first, explaining the situation in careful voices, but worry has a way of showing itself in the smallest details. Emily's shoulders were tight. Daniel kept rubbing the back of his neck as if the numbers on those pages might change if he stared long enough. Their mortgage payment had been coming due in just a few weeks. Daniel had recently changed jobs and the timing had not worked out the way they expected. The savings they thought would carry them through the transition had disappeared faster than planned. I remember the silence that filled my kitchen after they explained everything. It was not an uncomfortable silence, just the kind that arrives when a family is thinking carefully about the next step. The house I lived in was modest but comfortable, the same house where Emily had grown up learning to ride her bicycle on the sidewalk out front. The kitchen table had witnessed many conversations over the years, from homework struggles to holiday plans. That afternoon it witnessed another kind of conversation, one about responsibility and the quiet ways families support one another. I asked them a few simple questions about their situation, and Daniel answered honestly. He did not sound proud in that moment. He sounded tired and determined at the same time. I remember telling them that setbacks were not the end of a story. Sometimes they were only a pause before the next chapter. After a few minutes I stood up, walked to the small desk in the corner of the room, and opened the drawer where I kept my checkbook. The house was very quiet except for the rain and the faint hum of the refrigerator. When I returned to the table, I placed the check beside the stack of bills. Daniel looked at it first and then looked at me again as if he was not entirely certain what to say. Emily reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with relief. No speeches were made that afternoon. No applause followed the moment. It was simply a decision made quietly between three people who understood that sometimes progress requires help along the way. I finished the last bite of my dinner and glanced around the restaurant again. The celebration continued smoothly, the lights glowing warmly above the tables while Daniel accepted another round of congratulations. It was interesting how easily the memory of small turning points faded once life became comfortable again. Yet those turning points were often the very foundation beneath the success everyone admired. Across the restaurant, the celebration continued with the comfortable rhythm of a successful evening, plates being cleared away and replaced with small desserts while conversations grew louder and more relaxed. I folded my hands on the table and listened to the room the same way I had listened earlier to Daniel's speech, quietly and without interrupting the moment. The memory of that rainy afternoon lingered in my mind, not because it had been dramatic but because it had been simple and honest. Daniel had not always stood under bright lights accepting congratulations. There had been years when he was simply a young man trying to find his footing in a complicated world. I respected that part of his journey. Everyone begins somewhere. I glanced toward the far side of the room where Daniel now stood near the bar with a few senior managers from his company. They were discussing business strategies and upcoming opportunities with the excitement that often follows a promotion. Daniel spoke confidently, using phrases about growth and leadership that sounded polished and well-practiced. The group listened attentively, nodding with interest. From where I sat, I could also see Emily standing a short distance away speaking with one of Daniel's coworkers. She smiled politely as she spoke, though every so often her eyes drifted toward the stage where Daniel had given his speech earlier. I recognized that look. It was the same thoughtful expression she wore when she was younger and trying to understand something that did not quite feel right. A waiter arrived at my table carrying a small dessert plate with a slice of chocolate cake and a fork resting neatly beside it. I thanked him and took a small bite, the sweetness rich but gentle. Around me, guests continued enjoying the evening, some of them sharing stories about their own careers while others spoke about travel plans or children heading off to college. The room felt warm and welcoming, the kind of atmosphere people remember fondly after an event ends. Yet beneath that pleasant surface, I could not ignore a quiet detail that had been forming in my mind over the past several months. It had started with a small comment at a family dinner not long ago. Daniel had been telling a story about purchasing their home, explaining to a neighbor how he and Emily had worked tirelessly to secure the down payment. I had been sitting at the end of the table listening politely while he described the process with a tone of pride. At the time I said nothing, assuming he had simply shortened the story for convenience. Later that evening I overheard another conversation in the living room where he joked that Emily's mother had never needed to worry about money because she enjoyed living comfortably without the responsibilities younger families faced. The remark had been said casually, followed by a quick laugh as if it were harmless humor. No one challenged it. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway holding a glass of iced tea, listening quietly as the conversation moved on to other topics. It was the first moment I realized that Daniel's memory of the past might not be fading accidentally. It might be changing deliberately. Tonight, as I sat in the restaurant surrounded by people celebrating his accomplishments, that earlier moment returned with surprising clarity. I watched him again across the room, his confident voice rising above the soft music as he described future plans to his colleagues. The applause earlier had been genuine. His promotion was real and well-earned. But the story he was telling about the road that led here seemed to grow simpler each time it was repeated, as if certain details had quietly disappeared along the way. I set my fork down beside the empty dessert plate and rested my hands together again. The evening was still moving forward, one conversation blending into the next, and Daniel's version of events continued to circulate gently through the room like background music. I did not interrupt it. Not yet. Sometimes the clearest truth appears only after a story has been told enough times for everyone to hear exactly what it leaves out. The evening continued to unfold with the same smooth rhythm that had carried it from the beginning, conversations drifting between tables while the restaurant lights cast a warm glow across the room. I remained seated for a few more minutes, watching the movement of people and listening to the low hum of voices around me. Daniel's laughter rose again from across the room as someone told another congratulatory story about their time working together. It was easy to see why people admired him. He spoke confidently, he carried himself well, and success had begun to follow him in visible ways. None of that was surprising. What surprised me was how easily the past had begun to disappear from the story he told about himself. I looked toward the small stage where the microphone still rested on its stand. A simple object, black and unremarkable, but earlier it had carried a sentence that traveled across the entire room. The mother-in-law only came because she heard the food was free. The words had been delivered lightly, wrapped in laughter, but once spoken they did not simply vanish. Words have a quiet way of staying behind in a room long after people stop repeating them. I reached for my water glass again and took a slow sip, allowing the cool taste to settle my thoughts. The evening was not over yet. Waiters were beginning to clear the dinner plates and replace them with coffee cups. Some guests were gathering near the stage as if expecting another round of speeches before the night ended. I noticed Emily moving slowly through the crowd, thanking people for attending and smiling politely each time someone congratulated Daniel again. When she passed near my table, she paused for a moment. Our eyes met briefly. She gave me a small smile that carried a hint of apology, the same quiet expression she used when she was young and realized she had forgotten to call me back after a long day. I returned the smile and nodded gently, letting her know that I understood more than she needed to explain. Emily continued walking toward the bar where Daniel stood talking with two older men who looked like senior partners from his firm. Their voices were animated, discussing business strategies and the future of the department Daniel would now help lead. It was the kind of conversation that confirmed his promotion was more than ceremonial. He had entered a new circle, one that valued confidence and clear narratives about success. I remained seated for another moment, listening to the room and considering the path that had led us here. The memories from earlier years were not painful to recall. In fact, they carried a certain warmth. Families grow through shared effort, through seasons when one person carries more of the weight so another can move forward. That was never the problem. The problem begins when the weight itself is forgotten. I slowly pushed my chair back from the table and stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket with calm hands. No one nearby paid much attention. Guests were busy finishing their desserts and greeting friends across the room. I took a few quiet steps toward the stage, the soft carpet muffling the sound of my shoes. The microphone was still resting there exactly where Daniel had left it earlier, waiting patiently for whoever might speak next. I paused a few feet away and glanced around the room once more. Laughter continued near the bar. Music drifted gently from the speakers. Daniel was still telling a story to his colleagues, his back turned slightly toward the stage. For a brief moment I simply stood there, listening to the room breathe around me. Then I reached forward and picked up the microphone, holding it lightly in my hand while the quiet click of the sound system carried through the speakers and began to draw the attention of the room. The small click from the microphone echoed gently through the speakers and slowly the conversations in the restaurant began to soften. It was not an abrupt silence, but the natural pause that happens when a room senses that someone else might be about to speak. A few heads turned toward the stage. Then a few more. I stood there calmly, holding the microphone with both hands the way Daniel had earlier, waiting patiently while the last bits of conversation faded. From the corner of my eye I saw Daniel turn around from the bar. At first his expression showed mild curiosity, the kind of look people have when they are unsure who has stepped up to the microphone. Then recognition reached him. His smile paused for a brief second before he began walking slowly toward the center of the room. Emily also noticed me. She stopped mid-sentence with the coworker she had been speaking to and looked toward the stage, her expression careful and quiet. I cleared my throat softly and allowed a small smile to rest on my face, the same polite smile I had worn all evening. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice steady as the sound traveled through the speakers. "I promise I will only borrow a minute of your time." A few people chuckled lightly, assuming perhaps that I was about to offer a simple congratulation the way family members often do during celebrations like this. Several guests returned to their seats, curious to see what would be said. Daniel had now reached the front area of the room, standing just off to the side of the stage. He folded his arms loosely, trying to appear relaxed, though I noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. I looked out across the tables, seeing dozens of faces watching politely. Many of them I did not know. Colleagues. Friends. People who had come to celebrate Daniel's achievement and share a pleasant evening together. "First," I continued, "I would like to say how proud I am of Daniel tonight. Promotions do not happen by accident. They happen because someone works hard and stays determined even when things are not easy." Several guests nodded. The words were simple and sincere, and for a moment the room seemed to settle comfortably again. I glanced briefly toward Daniel. He gave a short nod in return, his expression cautiously appreciative. "When someone reaches a moment like this," I continued calmly, "people often tell the story of how it all happened. The long hours. The effort. The persistence. Those stories matter because they remind us that success is never built in a single day." I paused, letting the sentence rest quietly in the room. A waiter near the back stopped moving for a moment, listening like everyone else. "Earlier tonight Daniel shared a few memories about the journey that brought him here," I said gently. "And it reminded me of a small chapter from those earlier years that perhaps not everyone in this room knows about." I shifted the microphone slightly in my hands, not raising my voice but allowing it to carry clearly across the tables. "Many years ago, before the promotions and the celebrations, there was a rainy afternoon in my kitchen when Daniel and Emily sat at my table with a stack of bills and a great deal of worry. I saw Daniel's posture change slightly now, his arms lowering from their folded position. The room remained completely quiet. It was not a dramatic moment," I continued softly. "Just three people sitting together, trying to figure out how to keep moving forward." A few guests glanced toward Daniel, curious now. "That afternoon taught me something important," I said. "It taught me that success rarely belongs to just one person. It usually grows from many quiet moments that happen long before anyone holds a microphone." The room remained still, the soft hum of the air conditioning the only sound between my words as I prepared to continue the story that had started years before. The room remained quiet after my last sentence, the kind of quiet that does not come from discomfort but from curiosity. People were listening now. Not just politely waiting for a speech to end, but truly listening. I held the microphone gently and looked across the tables again, allowing the memory to continue exactly as it had happened years earlier. "That afternoon in my kitchen," I said calmly, "Daniel and Emily were facing a problem that many young families face sooner or later. Their mortgage payment was approaching, the new job had not started yet, and the savings they thought would last a few months had already begun to disappear." A few people in the room nodded quietly. Situations like that were familiar to many adults who had built their lives step by step. "It was raining outside," I continued, my voice steady and unhurried. Emily was holding a coffee mug with both hands, and Daniel had a stack of bills spread across the table. They were trying to find a solution. Not complaining. Just thinking. I paused briefly, letting the image settle in the room. Daniel now stood very still near the front, his eyes fixed on me. "Families help each other in those moments," I said simply. "Sometimes help looks like advice. Sometimes it looks like time. And sometimes it looks like something else entirely." I shifted my weight slightly and rested one hand on the edge of the small stage. That day I walked to the corner of the kitchen where I kept my desk and opened the drawer with my checkbook. I wrote a check that helped cover the mortgage payment and allowed them to stay in their home while Daniel finished the transition to his new position. A soft murmur moved through the room. It was not loud, just the natural reaction of people connecting a story to the present moment. I continued calmly, without raising my voice. Later that same year, when Daniel decided to return to school for his Master of Business Administration degree, Emily and Daniel both worried about how they would manage tuition and living expenses at the same time. So we worked through that problem together as well. I glanced briefly toward Daniel again, then back to the audience. I helped with part of the tuition during that time. Not because anyone asked in a dramatic way, but because families often support each other quietly when opportunity appears. The room was completely still now. No music. No laughter. Just attentive faces and the soft sound of air moving through the vents above. I want to be clear about something, I continued gently. Daniel absolutely worked hard for the promotion we are celebrating tonight. Long hours. Careful planning. Determination. Those things belong entirely to him. I gave a small respectful nod in his direction. But success rarely grows from only one pair of hands. It usually grows from many moments of support that happen long before anyone sees the final result. Several guests exchanged glances, the pieces of the story settling together naturally. So when I heard the earlier joke tonight about why the mother-in-law came to the celebration, I said with the same calm smile, I realized that perhaps the story simply needed one more small detail. I lowered the microphone slightly, allowing the quiet weight of the room to hold the moment as every person there understood exactly what that missing detail had been. The silence that followed settled across the room like a calm evening breeze, not heavy or uncomfortable, but thoughtful. I let the microphone rest lightly in my hands and looked across the faces gathered for the celebration. Some people were leaning forward slightly in their chairs now, while others simply watched with quiet attention. Daniel stood a few steps from the stage, his confident posture from earlier replaced by a more reflective stillness. Emily had moved closer to him without even realizing it, her eyes moving between the two of us. I allowed a gentle breath to pass before continuing. Now please understand, I said softly, I did not share that story to embarrass anyone. Life gives all of us moments where we need help. That is not something to be ashamed of. In fact, it is often the beginning of something better. A few guests nodded slowly. They recognized the truth in that simple statement. The only reason I mentioned those memories tonight, I continued calmly, is because success deserves to be remembered honestly. Not just the polished version that fits neatly into a speech, but the full story that includes every step along the way. I glanced briefly toward Daniel again, my expression steady and kind rather than confrontational. When Daniel joked earlier about why the mother-in-law came tonight, I knew it was meant to make people laugh. And laughter is not a bad thing at a celebration like this. A small ripple of relieved smiles moved through the room. But sometimes jokes forget the people who quietly stood in the background while the future was still uncertain. I shifted the microphone slightly and rested one hand along the edge of the stand. The truth is, I did not come tonight for the food. A few light chuckles returned, softer this time. I came because I remember the rainy afternoon in my kitchen when two young people were trying to keep their dream alive. I came because I believed in what they could build together. And I came because seeing Daniel reach this moment is something I am genuinely proud of. I paused, letting the sincerity of that statement fill the space. Daniel's expression had changed now. The tension that had briefly appeared earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter and more thoughtful. Families do not always tell their stories perfectly, I said gently. Sometimes pieces get left out along the way. But the good thing about stories is that they can always be remembered again. I offered a small smile toward the audience. So tonight, while we celebrate Daniel's promotion and the future that lies ahead for him and Emily, I simply wanted to make sure one small part of the journey was not forgotten. I lowered the microphone slightly, the room still completely attentive. Because success is stronger when it remembers where it started. For a moment no one spoke. Then someone at one of the tables began to clap softly. Another guest joined. Within seconds the quiet applause grew into a warm wave moving across the room, not loud or explosive but steady and respectful. I placed the microphone back onto the stand and stepped away from the stage, allowing the evening to return to its celebration while the truth of the story quietly settled into the room.